Hello, everybody. My name's Amelia.
I'm Tom.
We are GoTel Communications, bringing you another wonderful story from the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel lection for this coming Sunday. So, Tom,
And I have my Cambodia shirt on today.
right.
So shine like the sun or something.
Yeah, we have great memories of our biblical storytelling mission trip to Cambodia. What, 10 years ago now? It's been quite a while. Yeah,
Yep.
it was a wonderful, wonderful visit. All right, here we go. I'm going to put you on speaker view. There you go.
So Jesus was teaching large crowds sitting in a boat. And last week we remembered the story that he told from the boat of the parable of the sower. So he went inside and explained that to the disciples, and then apparently went back out and got in the boat again, because Matthew said that told them another parable of the kingdom. And he said, the kingdom of God can be compared to someone who went out and sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, so that when the plants came up and yielded grain, the weeds appeared with them also. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, Master, didn't you sow good seed in your field? How is it then there are all these weeds? And he said, an enemy has done this. And they said, well, shall we go then and gather the weeds? He said, no. For in gathering and collecting the weeds, you may also uproot the wheat. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at the harvest, I will tell the reapers, gather first all the weeds and bind them in bundles to be burned. And then he left the crowds and went to the house. The disciples came to him and said, Teacher, explain to us the parable of the weeds. He said, the one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. And the good seed are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed the weeds is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age. And the reapers are the angels. So just as the weeds are gathered together and burned, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will collect all causes of sin and all evildoers in his kingdom. And they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. But the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let anybody with ears listen.
Thank you, Tom. And I like the way you said that last line. So for our, before we start sort of our Q&A commentary, I have a question that has to do actually with your telling of the story.
Yeah.
And this, as with last week, this lectionary selection has, first a parable and then a gap, and then Jesus interpreting the parable. So I noticed in this, this time as you told it, with the parable part, your voice was relatively loud. I mean, you're talking to a computer and an imaginary audience out there, we hope, is listening. But
Right.
you still, you had some volume there, in contrast to when Jesus, in the second part, when Jesus is talking to the disciples, it seemed like there was a shift in volume, a little bit of a shift in tone as well. Was that, or am I, imagining that?
No, that was intentional. So if anything, I could have made the contrast greater. So the difference is between, imagining, remembering, telling the story of his telling a parable, sitting in a boat with a large crowds all lined up standing on the beach, then his talking with the disciples and explaining to them as a teacher what the parable, what it meant, and explaining it. So it's the difference between, I don't know, at some level, like a preacher and a teacher. Preachers tend to have more volume and then to, make a bigger deal about things. Teachers are trying to explain and get people to think.
Okay, great. Thank you. Good. Okay. So when Jesus is telling his parable to these people, this crowd who were standing on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, how does this parable reflect their experience? And would you say that's the same as the experience of people who then heard the parable, throughout the subsequent years, and Matthew finally wrote it down some, 30, 40 years later?
Well, I expect the situation of Jesus and his peasant audiences in Galilee. Those who would have come, who would have been interested in his teaching, would have been peasant farmers. And so this story reflects their experience of dealing with weeds in their fields. They didn't have any Roundup or any way of controlling weeds. And so every year, a major problem was that the weeds would grow up and choke some of the grain, and that it wouldn't yield. And so the issue of how to deal with the weeds was something that every farmer had to deal with every year. And probably this reflects what they did. That is, they didn't go into the fields and tromp through the good wheat plants to get to the weeds. They would have done more damage than to just let them grow and then to separate them at the time of the harvest. And I expect that this reflects what they actually did.
Okay. All right, now we kind of get into some harder subjects that this parable raises. One of which is fairly early on. The characters in the parable, well, besides the weeds and the wheat, but the human characters that set up that part of the parable, we have a householder and we have slaves. In our country today, there's a growing awareness and talk about our history of slavery and what we would call, a lot of us call, America's original sin. That's still impacting all kinds of relationships and justice for a lot of people continues to be a major problem in our country. And I know that during the time of slavery, that institution was justified by the Bible. among other ways. And one of the reasons it could be justified by the Bible was that clearly there were slaves, and no biblical character, including Jesus, questioned the existence of slavery and slaves. So how do we, what do we do with that? I think some translations have moved from calling them slaves to calling them servants. Is that the way to go? Or, help us with this problem, if you would.
Actually, the translation has gone the other way. In the RSV, it was translated, this word, doulos, was translated as servants. But what the translators of the NRSV and some of the other translations have used slaves, because clearly that's what it meant. They were not servants who were hired to do chores. They were slaves. And in the Roman Empire, in the whole of the world period, between 35 to 45% of people were slaves. And in Galilee, a feature of slavery was that tenant farmers, that might own their land, but then they'd have to go into debt when they had a famine or a bad harvest or something, and they'd then lose their land, which would be sold, and they would become tenant farmers. But then if they had big disasters in relation to their tenant farms, they'd be sold into slavery. And so that they were, and there were a lot of slaves. That's clearly the case. It was a major institution. It was a terrible system of slavery, but the Roman Empire was significantly based on that slavery. And what the Jesus movement did, they didn't mount a campaign to try to abolish slavery. That would have been out of the question. It simply would not have been possible. But what they did do was that they included slaves in their communities as fully equal with people who were aristocrats and everything in between. And so a part of the population of the early Jesus movement, a substantial percentage were slaves, who were also drawn to Jesus because one of the central stories was his being crucified, like slaves were. And so they identified with Jesus, and his teaching and so on was a teaching that was available to everyone, and that they were welcomed into the Jesus community. So the strategy that they pursued in regard to the undermining of slavery was to change the whole way in which slaves saw themselves and the way in which they related to others.
That helps. Thank you. I needed some help with that one. Okay, next question.
It doesn't solve it. I mean, that is clearly an issue, and it was clearly possible for people who wanted to defend slavery to cite all the places in the Bible where there were slaves, and that was accepted. And that's simply, I think, the way it was.
Okay. All right, next question. End of the age. Jesus talks about the end of the age. What does he mean by that?
Well, the end of the age was, it grew out of the reflection what happened in the various ages of the empires of the ancient Near East. So the Babylonian, first the Assyrian Empire was a huge empire. Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrians. And then the Babylonians, and then the Persians. And the Persian period, the Persian age went on for centuries. But at the end of each of these ages, there was a time of enormous conflict and punishment of those who had been the agents of that age. So the capital of Nineveh of the Assyrians was burned. The whole city, huge city, was wiped out within a couple weeks by the Babylonians. And then Babylon and the cities of Babylon, they were wiped out by the Persians. So this idea of the end of the age being a time of judgment on those who had committed crimes, who were in charge of these empires, that there would be a time at the end of their age when there would be an accounting of what had happened, and that there would be punishment. And that got extended in the course of the development of apocalyptic to being seen as the end of the world. And so the end of the age morphed into the end of the world as we know it. So that, for example, in the Revelation of John is the image that one has, that's the language. But the end of the age was an earlier reflection of the development of eschatology. And eschatology means the last things. Well, it's the last things of the age. What will happen at the end of the age? And so that's what this parable is about. And part of Jesus' teaching is then that the coming of the kingdom of God will be the end of the age of the dominance of the powers of evil. And that at the end of the age, the Son of Man will be victorious over the spiritual powers of evil.
Well, going along with that, it's kind of in that same frame. Jesus says a time will come when all evildoers will be thrown into a furnace of fire, which sounds to me like our concept of hell. And even he brings up fire and brimstone. So we've heard of fire and brimstone preaching, and some of us have rejected that, but it's clear in Matthew and it's what Jesus talked about. It doesn't seem to me to fit the idea of a God that Jesus often presents to us as being merciful and forgiving, one who loves even the tax collectors. This begins to make you think, who is an evildoer? What sins are such that you would be, as an individual or as a community, thrown into eternal fire? I guess it doesn't say eternal here, but that's the language we get sometimes. So what is Jesus getting at here? Is that's what he's getting at, that we need to be really scared of of our ultimate destiny and a place of eternal torment?
Well, what he's getting at is justice. The framework of biblical eschatology is, it may look as if you can do whatever you want and there will be no cost to be paid. But the judgment at the end of the age is that those who have done evil, those who have killed thousands of people, those who are responsible for these great crimes, and those who have done, evil things to other people, they will be judged. There will be a time of justice. So it's not as if you'll be able to get by with all this and there will be no consequences. The proclamation of the kingdom of God was also a proclamation of justice. And the possibility of being forgiven and of not being fully punished for the evil that one has done is clearly possible. And but part of the function of this parable and part of its impact was to get people's attention. Pay attention to what you're doing, and the doer will be, like the wheat thrown in the fire and burned. So if you want to pay attention to what the possibilities of God's justice will be, then pay attention to what you're doing and to what is happening in the world, and act in a way that is just and forgiving and loving. So I think that's a significant dimension of what's going on in a number of Jesus' parables. It's kind of shock therapy. And for
Yeah,
people
well,
to think.
I have to say, as you talk, it does kind of make me think about the almost immediate, well, the whole, with what's going on with this pandemic, that, so if we don't wear our masks and engage in social distancing and take those kinds of precautions, suddenly we have unbelievable skyrocketing number of cases and deaths.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a mundane example, but it does feel like if we ignore or pretend there isn't an issue,
Yeah.
there are consequences.
There are consequences.
Yeah.
I wouldn't call that justice necessarily.
No.
In some cases, it feels like that with people who are flaunting the need to wear masks and flaunting that there is an epidemic and so on. So there's a certain sense in which you can have the thought, well, they're getting what they deserve. But no, that isn't the spirit.
No, probably because there's so many people who aren't.
Who are innocent. Well, everybody at some level is innocent in relation to this virus, which is a
Okay, I want to come back to what you were saying about paying attention, because it sort of brings up the very last line of this parable, and of Jesus' interpretation, which is the same. He ends the same way that he ends his parable of the sower.
Right.
Talking to disciples, he ends it by saying, "Let those who have ears to hear listen."
Right.
In this case, how are we to listen?
Yeah, well, a first thing is, one of the problems that we have with the Bible now is that we don't listen. We read it in silence. And major dimensions of the impact of the Bible get lost because we don't listen. We don't hear it. That's true of biblical scholarship. It has become largely a silent practice. So one of the values of biblical storytelling and all this is to call attention to hearing, to bring these stories to I don't know, into a place of hearing. And that for Jesus and the composers of the Gospels, that's what they were doing. They were performing these stories for audiences who would hear them. That was true for Jesus. The scene is painted by Matthew of crowds along the beach, standing along the beach, and Jesus speaking out of a boat to these large crowds, and that they would listen. They came to listen. And apparently, he would have these teaching sessions out in the wilderness that would go on for a day. And so all of us who are prone to talking longer than maybe initially circumscribed, Jesus did that in spades. And so he would talk for hours about the kingdom of God, and people loved it. But it's also about attention. What's clear from memory research now is that the first thing that determines whether someone can remember something is whether it gets their attention. And Jesus was a great attention getter. He would do things and say things that would get people's attention. And so that's the case here. What gets your attention is the possibility of being thrown into the furnace and burned. That'll get your attention. And and almost all of Jesus' parables have something like that is shocking or surprising or exaggerated. And so he was a great teacher who understood about getting people's attention.
So Jesus was a great healer. He was a great teacher, and he was a great attention getter.
That's right.
Okay, great. Well,
right.
We thank you for your attention, everyone. Have a really good week. Get into this parable. I hope you can learn it by heart and tell it to your congregation or to or to your grandchildren, or to your spouse, or even to your pet, or to
Yeah,
God as an
yeah,
offering of what you've, how you've engaged
right.
with the Lord.
Get
Bye-bye.
their attention, right? Just like Jesus.